The Propagation of the Gospel. 25. The general epistles of James and Peter. There have been some doubts concerning the epistle of James, both as to it being a really canonical book and as to the writer. Both before and after the Didache and the list of books in the Bible, including the Apocrypha, one variation of the Apocrypha anyways. Before and after there's been disputes about adding and subtracting things. So in modern times, the chief objection to its canonicity has arisen from the supposed antagonism of a part of it to other writings of the New Testament. While contradictions never stopped anybody from, accepting something as part of the Bible or the collection of books before, this objection, however, when critically examined, is found to have little weight, and there is, at present, a nearly unanimous opinion among the evangelical writers that it is a genuine part of the New Testament. There appear to have been 3 or 4 prominent persons by the name of James among the early disciples. 2 of these were apostles, viz. James, the brother of John, and James, the son of Alphaeus. James, the Lord's brother, is also spoken of. And there's also a possible 4th James, Matthew 13:55, Mark 6:3. And there's actually a lot of Jameses, so just because one of the same names as the story. Well, Jacobos, Jakub, are other languages that can have some variation of this. There's certainly going to be a lot of individuals with the name as common as Jacob. The best authorities identify the son of Alphaeus and the Lord's brother as the same. The only difficulty is in the family relationship, but the term brother is often used in the Bible to denote a near kinsman, and there are still other ways of accounting for the legitimate use of the term. The epistle could hardly have been written by the brother of John the Apostle, as he suffered martyrdom in the first persecution of the Christians under Herod. There is not much doubt that it was written by James, the son of Alphaeus, who also appears by the narrative of Luke. Well, Luke was writing a full century after the date that we have for the crucifixion, so that's kind of... and the letters of Paul to have had a kind of primacy among the apostles at Jerusalem. It was probably written about 62 of the Common Era. Now, carbon dating and other evidence has changed a lot of these dates rather than, it's part of our doctrine that this text existed at this time, and we can't find the evidence to support it, but we're going to keep repeating it. Now, absence of evidence is one thing, but contrary information, quite another thing. It has been intimated one great occasion of contention concerning this epistle is found in the author's comparison of faith and works, in which he has been by some supposed to be in flat contradiction to Paul. It is strange that such an impression could have so widely prevailed, clearly enough to a careful and critical reader. While one writer makes faith prominent and the other works, there is no antagonism. The one is insisting on faith as the vital and essential thing, as against those who teach a righteousness to be secured through observance of the ceremonial law. The other defends such works as are implied in obedience to the divine commands against those who teach that moral conduct is of no consequence so long as the belief is correct, or so long as one trusts in Christ, whose righteousness will then be substituted for one's own. neither teaches that mere opinion or blind trust or that legal obedience will make the want of the soul. Both believe that such a trust in Christ is necessary as it implies a purpose to do and be and bear what God requires. The epistle is addressed to the converted Jews and Israelites who were scattered abroad among the nations, though some of the allusions point also to the Jews in their national capacity. It is evidently intended to convey to them positive instruction on the subject of Christian morals. It also guards them against the harmful notions which were beginning to be disseminated in certain quarters to the effect that a formal acceptance of Christ was all that was essential and that the moral character availed nothing. It abounds in forcible appeals, bold rebukes, earnest exhortations, and wholesome advice. The first epistle of Peter was written, as the address indicates, to companies of Christians scattered throughout the world, though more particularly to those of Asia Minor. The phraseology might indicate that the classes addressed were the same as those to whom James wrote, viz., Christian Jews. But there are intimations in the text of the epistle which would not agree with this supposition. Such are those contained in 2, verse 10 through 4, verse 3. The apostle appears to have been at Babylon when he wrote, and though there have been differences of opinion as to what particular place is meant, the majority of reputable authorities agree that it was the New Babylon, built in the vicinity of the site of the famous imperial city. There were many Jewish residents there, and Peter had doubtless made that the center of one of his great missionary campaigns. The time of its writing was probably somewhere between 60 and 64 of the Common Era. The design of the epistle, wherewith also the contents correspond, was to comfort and encourage the Christians, many of whom were passing through severe trials, to enforce the practical duties involved in their religious profession, to warn them against special temptations attached to their position, to remove all doubt as to the completeness and soundness of the system which they had received. The last was the more needful, as we have seen in Paul's epistles, that there were parties opposed to the latter, and who endeavored to divert the churches founded by him on the ground that Peter and the older apostles were of higher authority. The instructions and exhortations of this epistle were well calculated to set at rest any such agitations and dissensions. It is also worthy of note that the churches to which the parties here addressed belonged were founded chiefly by Paul, and this fact, as well as the tone of the epistle, wholly dissipates the ancient theory of any antagonism between the two apostles. The style of the epistle is what we might expect in one written by Peter, earnest, fervid, impulsive, and emotional. Yet, with all these qualities chastened and controlled, there are many passages of great power and glowing eloquence. The second epistle of Peter, unlike the first, has been a subject of much controversy, both as to its authenticity and its canonicity. The chief ground of doubt concerning it is found in the supposed dissimilarity of style to the first epistle. It is true that there are some grounds for this supposition. The two epistles are, in some respects, alike, yet this lack of similarity is not predictable of the whole of the two epistles. There are also some parts of this epistle which bear a striking resemblance to that of Jude, so that some have surmised that they had one author. On the other hand, there are internal evidences that the first and second epistles were both by the author whose names they bear. The opening passage of this epistle announces the writer to be Simon Peter, a servant and apostle of Jesus Christ. It is also said in verse 1 of chapter 3, the second epistle. This second epistle, beloved, I now write unto you, in both which I stir up your pure mind by way of remembrance. He also alludes in a striking way to the transfiguration and the voice from the most excellent glory, and goes on to declare, and this voice which came from heaven we heard when we were with him in the holy mount. 1:17 and 18. These passages would indicate that the authorship clearly enough, unless this was an intentional forgery, and we can hardly divine motive for so audacious an act. Well, obviously Moses didn't write, and then Moses died, or how it says that. But there was thousands of changes between the 10,000 variants, and it's not just linguistic variants. So why is that? Moreover, a forgery would have been likely to have imitated the style of the assumed writer rather than have differed so much from it. This letter was evidently written to the same parties to whom the former was addressed. The time and place of its writing are unknown. If Peter ever came to Rome, it was probably written there. In any case, its date was probably not long before his death, or about the year 64 of the Common Era. The design of the epistle was to remind those to whom it was written of the true principles of the Christian faith, and to warn them against the pernicious teachings of some whom the writer foresaw would undertake to lead them away from the simplicity of the truth. The characteristics of these teachers and their teaching are somewhat vividly set forth. There are some important doctrines which are brought out more fully here than elsewhere in the Bible. Among these are the statements concerning the final conflagration of the world and the new heavens and the new earth. James, 1 Peter, and 2 Peter. How many different persons bear the name of James among the disciples of Jesus? Well, at least 4 that we're hearing about here, but... And if we're looking for Jacob's or Jacob's, which one is supposed to be the author of the epistle bearing this name? What was formerly the main ground of doubt concerning the authenticity of this epistle? To what other apostle was it supposed to be opposed, and in what respect? To whom is the epistle addressed? 1:1. What instruction does it convey? What cautions does it contain? How many trials prove a benefit? So chapter 1 with the last couple questions, but verses 2 through 4 of chapter 1. If we lack wisdom, what are we to do? Very important verse growing up, James 1:5, but verses 5 through 8. Will it do any good to ask for what we do not mean to use? What is implied in faith here? What of the vanity of wealth? 10 and 11. The cause of temptation? 12 through 15. Whence all gifts? 17. Difference between mere hearing and doing? 22 through 25. Genuine religion? 26 and 27. Don't accuse people of not listening because they don't just agree with you or that sort of thing, or obey you or something. Genuine religion, 26 and 27. What is said of the greater probability that the poor will be acceptable to God than the rich? Chapter 2, verses 5 through 7. The royal law and its application, 8 through 13. How does the writer represent the relation of faith and works? 14 through 26. Is that passage that talks about faith without works is dead, or that sort of thing. How is this to be reconciled with the doctrine of faith as the condition of salvation? See the introduction. There is a faith which is more assent or belief, and another which implies the practice of divine requirements. Which does this writer mean? Well, it's probably the Greek word, isn't it? What instruction is given concerning the liabilities of the tongue? Chapter 3, verse 1 through 12. What two kinds of wisdom and their difference? 13 through 18. What do you find concerning selfishness in the living and in religious effort? Chapter 4, verse 1 through 6. Rule for calculations of the future, 13 through 16. What rebuke to mere worldly and selfish men, 5, 1 through 6. Advice to the pious and persecuted. What great hope is expressed, verse 7. Examples of endurance, verses 10 and 11. Simplicity of speech, verse 12, utility and power of prayer, 13 through 18, the good effected by converting a soul, 19 and 20, to whom was the first epistle of Peter written, where and when, what Babylon was this, and why was Peter there, what is there in the epistle, and the circumstances calculated to dissipate the theory of any antagonism between Peter and Paul. See the introduction. Well, differences of opinion. A theory is something based on the facts to date, and if it's just a guess and it's not supported by the facts, it's not a theory. But what were some of the objects of the epistle? See the introduction. So we see the various Christian thinkers and how myth and theory has, for so many people, not kept its meaning. What were some of the objects of the epistle? Also see the introduction. Under the first design, what encouragements are mentioned? Chapter 1, verse 3, 4, 6, and 7. What are, we're in Peter right up. 4, verses 12 and 13. What are some of the duties enjoined under the second head, as for instance, what duties of consecration? Chapter 1, verse 13 through 16. Chapter 3, verses 15 of society. Chapter 2, verse 13 through 17 of domestic life. 18, 3, 1 and 7 of Christian brotherhood. 1, 22, 2, 1 through 5, 3, 8 and 9, 4, 8 through 11, 5, 1 through 3, and also verse 5 of that, of watchfulness, chapter 5, verses 8. What warnings against special temptations? Sensuality, chapter 2, 11 and 12, 4, 2, 3, and 4, vanity, 3, verses 3 and 4, vindictiveness, verse 9. What's in between? 5, 6, 7, 8. What confirmation does the writer give of the chief doctrines of redemption? Chapter 1, verses 8 through 12, 18 through 21, 2, 21 through 25, 3, 18 through 22. Do you find any intimation in favor of those Jewish observances on which the enemies of Paul insisted? What controversy has there been concerning the second epistle of Peter, the ground of the supposition that it is unauthentic? What internal evidence in favor of its genuineness? Introduction and 1:1, 3:1, 1:17 and 18. What are the probabilities of a forgery? I don't think it's as simple as forgery, non-forgery, but to whom and when was it written? The design of the letter? What are some of the characteristics of the false teachers against which warning is given to verses 1 through 3, 10, 12 through 14, the style of their teaching, 17 through 19, the results of such living and teaching as illustrated by the Old Testament examples, chapter 2, 4 through 6, verses 15, 16, 21, and 22. Against what does he particularly warn those to whom he writes? 3, 2 through 4. How does it illustrate the Spirit? 5 and 6. What predictions are more explicit than we find elsewhere in this New Testament are given concerning the termination of the present period? 7, 10, 12, 13. What exhortations are found on this declaration? 11, 14, 17. What reference to Paul's writings? Verses 15 and 16. Give the list of Christian virtues in their logical order. Chapter 1, verses 5 through 7. What is the character of the address and exhortation of the opening chapter?